Okay, all right. Well, I think we are about ready to get started here. So I just want to welcome everybody to to today's presentation. I'm Diane Okonski. I'm the president of the Icelandic National League of the United States, and I'm very happy that you're able to join us today. Before we get started, there's just a couple of things I want to remind you of. As attendees to the webinar, you are on mute, but we do want to hear your questions. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're on a tablet or a phone, you may find that Q&A button in the upper right-hand corner, or even you may have to swipe and find it on a different screen. But please submit your questions. We will get to as many as possible during today's session. I also want to remind you that the program is being recorded and will be on the INLUS website in just a matter of days. So today we are thrilled to have with us Dr. Katelin Parsons to talk with us about the Fragile Heritage Project. Katelin is the project manager for the Fragile Heritage Project at the Árni Magnússon Institute in Reykjavik, and is a newly minted PhD, having received her PhD this last December from the University of Iceland. So Katelin, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm just going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Diane, and thanks so much for having me from Reykjavik. I really appreciate being able to come. I'm sorry I can't be there in person for an in-person meeting to see everyone, but I hope we have a chance to get to know each other in the Q&A. And I'd love to keep this pretty informal, just a conversation, so that we have, if anyone wants to ask something to do with heritage or manuscripts or Icelandic, anything, just feel free to ask in the Q&A. So I do have a presentation to start out with, and then we can kind of get back and forth Q&A and the conversation going. So the project is called the Fragile Heritage Project, and heritage is really the key to our work, and we approach it very much as shared heritage. It's not just the heritage of one group, but really of the Icelanders, the Canadians, and the Americans, and so it is internationally shared heritage. And the question that we started out with when we started this project was really, what is the best way to take care of shared heritage? It's not something you can just put in one location easily. It is in many locations. It's very scattered. It's all across 3 countries, really. What's the best way to handle that kind of heritage? Heritage can take the form of traditions, knowledge, or physical objects of every different kind and shape, and from small objects like books and manuscripts like we're dealing with, to entire buildings and huge neighborhoods can even be heritage. And in a way, all heritage is shared. It's what makes wienerterta or butter tarts or grandma's special casserole different from some kind of a dinner just thrown together in the fridge. Just like a giant batch of cookies fresh out of the oven, I think you can say that heritage is something that you really pass around and you share within a group of family, a group of friends, a community, or even within an entire country. And over time, there's modifications and experimentations, but despite that, there's a sense of something shared. And even though there might be some disagreements over the ingredients, do you put cardamom in? Do you not put cardamom in? Should there be raisins? Should there never be raisins? It's still this sense that there is a commonality and something shared. But what happens when you have a shared past and you end up going separate ways, just as the Icelandic immigrants did in the last century and the 19th century? Because heritage isn't always a building that stays just in one place. Family members and friends can move away over the years, and communities can change very rapidly as older generations pass on and newcomers move in. So you have something like favorite recipes, and those can be shared easily between the generations. But you have treasured objects like hand-painted chests and handwritten books and letters, and those are actually much harder to divide and to decide who in the family gets Amma's, special chest or something like that. It can be quite hard to share this kind of heritage fairly. And I think for a lot of families and communities, sharing heritage online has become a really important solution. It doesn't need to be formal. You can just post on Facebook an image of an old family photo, or you can have an old family cabin we went to visit, and here's a cake I made from an old recipe that we always used to have. And the social part of social media, I think, is really ideal for that kind of sharing, this casual back and forth exchange, keeping shared heritage alive and passing it on to others. And outside of social media, you also have initiatives like Icelandic Roots. It's a great example of building an online community of people with a shared interest in this shared Icelandic North American heritage. So if it works so well for families and friends and neighborhoods and communities, why don't more libraries, archives, and even whole countries make better use of that kind of potential? And a lot of organizations do really amazing social media work and digitization projects of their own material. But there's huge challenges that arise as soon as you start working on shared heritage between different libraries and museums, between different communities and even different countries, where you have different legislation even on how you're allowed to share things. So without getting into too much detail in what I think is short presentation, a major current challenge for digital archives is actually solving what's called a silo. So you have an infrastructure that does a great job of preserving what's inside, but it makes sharing between quite tricky. A silo building is really designed to keep your content safe by minimizing the number of entrance and exit points. It's kind of like a temperature controlled vault in a heritage institution, where you don't want the mice getting in, you don't want the water getting in, you don't even want the cold air getting in. That's great, but how do you share what's inside? A lot of digital silos aren't architecturally intentional. They're just the results of different ways of building, digitizing, and storing information between different groups and different institutions. And there can be hundreds of different ways of building a website and sharing information. So that was actually the original project that the Fragile Heritage Project was seeking out to solve, where you have libraries and community organizations across North America that don't necessarily have the resources to make their contents available to share to researchers, but they have all this wonderful material in Icelandic language that a lot of people were interested in. And a lot of people were very happy to share it, but there wasn't any kind of an infrastructure in place for that kind of talking between. And as we kept going on, we found increasingly the importance of families and community in this dimension. There's a lot of manuscripts, diaries, letters in the Icelandic language in the United States and Canada that are very much family heirlooms. They're just as special as, Amma's Vínaterta and drinking coffee together and talking about old stories. These are still very precious objects within families. We're not asking people to give those up just so that we can research them. What happened in the 20th century, I think, is that a lot of these kind of heritage material in Icelandic got sent from North America to the National Library of Iceland by families who did want to ensure its preservation. And I think that's made it easier for researchers in Iceland to have access to the material, the manuscripts by immigrant poets and authors and original sources on Icelandic immigrants in North America. But that's definitely not what we're doing here. It's not only researchers and universities who are interested in keeping the original documents and manuscripts in Icelandic, and digital photography is an ideal way of sharing without having to physically ask people to give away their most precious family treasures. We weren't the first initiative to be doing a similar kind of work. In the early 2000s, there was a librarian from the University and National Library of Iceland by the name of Hólmfríður Tómasdóttir. Some of you may know her. She made several trips to the US and Canada, and she was looking for original documents and manuscripts still owned by families of Icelandic descent who were willing to share that information by means of copies. And she called her project Arfur Íslendinga í Vesturheimi, or Icelandic Heritage in North America. And the idea was to collect copies of original material for researchers in Iceland by physically going between different areas of Canada and the United States, and then meeting with individuals and families. And she was approaching this as shared heritage of shared value to communities in North America and in Iceland. And at the time, photocopying was really the technology that she had to rely on. So most of what she collected were black and white photocopies. I began my own research a few years later in 2009. By that time, I could already use a digital camera to do the work. I moved to Iceland in 2003, and of course I brought a digital camera with me so I could take pictures of Iceland and the volcanoes and send them back home. And it was exactly the same camera that I used to take pictures of the manuscripts that I was looking at as I was taking, tourist pictures. It was a very fast way to copy manuscripts, and it wasn't invasive like a photography machine or scanner can actually be a bit damaging because of the light, and you're having to press it down, which you don't always want to do with fragile documents. So photography was ideal, but I didn't initially in 2009 have any kind of a budget. I was staying just with friends and family. So I had quite a limited radius in Manitoba. I didn't get to the States at that point. In 2015, things really took off. That's when the Fragile Heritage Project was launched, and that was thanks to the combined efforts of Guðrún Nordal, the director of the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies. She's still the director, and the late Svava Gesson, the former Consul General of Iceland in Winnipeg, who passed away at the beginning of the year and is deeply missed. He was very instrumental in the first kind of getting the project launched and pushing for it to go ahead immediately. And the project's Icelandic name is, I love the Icelandic name, it's Í fótspor Árni Magnússonar í Vesturheimi, in the footsteps of Árni Magnússon in North America. And that was the brilliant contribution of Árni, the Honorary Consul General in Minneapolis. For those who know who Árni Magnússon was, those are large shoes to fill. But unfortunately, not everybody knows who Árni Magnússon was. And because this is a webinar where I do get to give a presentation, and Diane said I could talk for 40 minutes or however, I decided to educate everyone a bit more on Árni Magnússon and why this is a brilliant name for the project. Árni Magnússon, I'm not going to give you can Google him. He's very famous, and you can find lots of pictures of him when you're finished watching this webinar. He was born in 1663, and he's the only person on a global basis whom I'm aware of who is responsible for not just one, but 2 items on the UNESCO Memory of the World Register, which is incredible. So first, the 1703 census of Iceland, and second, and probably most famously, a unique collection of medieval and early modern manuscripts that's currently housed partly in Reykjavik and partly in Copenhagen. So again, shared heritage. Árni Magnússon was born at a time when medieval vellum manuscripts were vanishing from Iceland. Some books were being picked up by collectors and moved out of the country, but a large number were simply wearing out from use, falling apart, being replaced by newer, prettier, more readable paper manuscripts, which were quite cheap by then to produce. Paper was a comparatively new technology compared to the vellum manuscripts. Vellum was a very old technology of producing manuscripts by literally taking a calf skin, scraping it off, stretching it on a frame, and then writing it, painstakingly. These were very, very expensive objects that required an enormous amount of labor, whereas paper you could buy from the merchants. So as long as you had the resources to buy the paper, you could quite quickly produce manuscripts. The vellum manuscripts by this point in the 17th century were hard to read. People weren't always as interested in them, but nevertheless, they preserved very unique literature and a complete treasure trove of linguistic information about the Old Norse language in the Middle Ages and how it had developed over the centuries, as well as a wealth of information about the medieval manuscript culture in Scandinavia and Scandinavian history. And that kind of information couldn't easily be transferred to this new technology of paper manuscripts, so it was in danger of being lost forever. Árni Magnusson's work to save this manuscript legacy of the past was really a lifetime effort. It wasn't something he did in a year or some kind of push initiative. He was committed for life. His approach was, though, fairly unique for the time, and that instead of concentrating on intact books, as most people before him had done, he spent an enormous effort to track down the medieval books that weren't in one piece anymore, manuscripts that had been pulled apart years later and used for other purposes, such as book covers and book binding. So just the tiniest little fragments. He didn't care as long as it was an original manuscript. He wanted it in his collection. Árni Magnússon wasn't the first person to attempt to preserve and collect these manuscripts. It was around the time that Árni Magnússon was born in 1663 that both Danish and Swedish scholars were very seriously interested in collecting Iceland's manuscript heritage and were making trips back and forth or commissioning people to try to find these objects and bring them into libraries in especially Denmark and Sweden. There weren't any libraries in Iceland at the time in the modern sense. Manuscripts were either owned as family heirlooms or kept in Iceland's cathedrals and churches. And this was really positive, I'd say, in the sense that it wasn't easy for one person to pay for Iceland's manuscript heritage to be kind of shipped out en masse. A wealthy king or wealthy aristocrat couldn't just decide, I want it all, take it with him, put him in his royal treasury. That's in contrast to actually a lot of Iceland's gold and silver objects that have been in the church. So the church history, there were a lot of gold and silver objects that were taken by the Danish king immediately after the Reformation. He needed those objects to pay for his warfare, so they were shipped out en masse and just melted down, and that part of the heritage was completely lost. This didn't happen to the Icelandic manuscripts. But to be completely fair, this wasn't either the idea that they were just being taken out to be sold. It was never about resale values. I think the interest in manuscripts has never been how much they're worth on the market. They're not necessarily worth that much. Many would-be collectors, including the Danish king himself, were motivated by genuine interest in preserving the shared heritage that they represented. And although they wanted to manage control of the heritage and they wanted to take it into their own hands, they also saw these collection efforts as a way of improving access for very serious scholars. And I think Icelandic scholars didn't fundamentally disagree with that vision either. And it's unfortunate fact of history that many nations have experienced the very painful loss of national treasures without those treasures being recognized as shared heritage. They're almost like trophies of war, or just we found them first, or these kind of attitudes. That wasn't the attitude in 17th century Scandinavia. There was a sense that Icelanders could provide very valuable insights about the literature found in Icelandic manuscripts. So that literature might describe the deeds of the ancient kings of Sweden and Denmark, but it couldn't be easily separated from this island nation whose language and whose culture and whose literature preserved it. And this growing recognition of the importance of Icelandic manuscripts gave very young and ambitious Icelanders the opportunity to be taken suddenly very seriously as scholars. For many decades previous to Árni Magnússon's birth, going to university for an Icelander generally meant spending a few years in Copenhagen as a young adult learning about theology before returning home back to Iceland for a career that was almost certainly within the Icelandic church. If you were very lucky, you became the bishop, but it was still within the church. Icelanders had a very peripheral position in the imagination of most Europeans in the 16th and 17th century. There were European writers who described Iceland as a very strange and sinister island surrounded by very rich and bountiful fishing grounds, but it wasn't seen as a powerhouse of learning. But now that with the rise of manuscripts, Icelanders could become the leading authorities in the field. So instead of learning about what the experts had to say and then bringing that home as previously, they could become the experts, and other scholars would take them very seriously. And Árni Magnússon was precisely one of these Icelanders who took this opportunity that opened up. He was the first Icelander to become a university professor. And it had a lot to do with his own heritage. I think many people would agree. As a young boy, he'd lived in the household of his own Amma and Avi, Guðlaug Pálsdóttir and Ketill Jørundsson. His Avi, Ketill Jørundsson, had been one of Iceland's leading scribes. And although Ketill died when Árni was 7, Ketill and his entire family's legacy would leave a lifelong mark on Árni, who was very passionate about manuscripts throughout his life, even as a quite young man. He started in university in 1683, just a few months before his 20th birthday, and he was essentially a lifelong student. They could never kick him out again. He never left, and eventually he became a university professor at the University of Copenhagen, which was a landmark for Icelandic history, kind of first. Árni Magnússon built his library of medieval manuscripts piece by piece and fragment by fragment, year by year. And he painstakingly attempted to track down and trace where lost manuscripts had gone and who in the country might own surviving scraps. And that definitely wasn't an easy task, because I think many of you will probably have visited Iceland. The road infrastructure as it is can be quite scary to travel around the ring road on Iceland in certain parts. And if you can imagine, there weren't even, bridges over a lot of those rivers at the time, those massive glacier rivers. They had to be crossed by, horse and ferry. And, the glaciers and none of this infrastructure was in place. So traveling across Iceland to try to track down where these manuscripts had got to was incredibly dangerous and tricky. And so a lot of Árni Magnússon's communication took place by letter and finding contacts to act as go-betweens. It was a very rural population, very spread out, and as I said, incredibly challenging terrain. And the final tallies for Árni Magnússon's collection are very impressive, especially considering that parts of it were actually lost in the fire of Copenhagen in 1728. Árni Magnússon's achievements included collecting over 2,000 Icelandic manuscripts and over 13,000 historical documents from all parts of the country. Without Árni Magnússon, we would have a completely different idea of Icelandic history, especially in the medieval period. A lot of manuscripts would have been lost forever of those 2,000. Without Árni Magnússon, we would definitely have fewer surviving Icelandic sagas, and we would have less complete texts. So for example, I have brought here one of the most famous Icelandic Sagas, Brennenjal Saga. This is the Íslensk fornit edition. So this is an edition of an Icelandic saga. And it's inevitable that when you turn to the page where they say, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read this, they say, here's the section of the manuscripts, and always inevitably when you're reading the manuscripts, it goes, yes, okay, the oldest one is belonging to Árni Magnússon's collection. Yeah, and then the next oldest, also Árni Magnússon's collection. Then comes one that's not in Árni Magnússon's collection. Then comes Árni Magnússon, 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 somebody else, Árni Magnússon, Árni Magnússon, somebody else, and Árni Magnússon. So it gives you an idea of just, this is just a single saga, and it gives you just an idea of what a massive contribution he made to the preservation of Icelandic literature in the medieval period. But it's not just the sagas. Without Árni Magnússon, we would know a lot less about the language as well. And we would still be able to watch the Vikings on TV, but we probably would be missing some of the fun characters and a lot of the plot lines. So, and we can even thank Árni Magnússon for a lot of genealogical information that we have today about the medieval period. Many of the historical documents that he collected contain genealogical information. And then that's not even to mention the treasure trove that is the 1703 census of Iceland that he co-managed in collaboration with his friend Katelin. So he was like a powerhouse there of saving Icelandic culture in the early 18th century. So that was my presentation on who Árni Magnússon is. So now when I say in the footsteps of Árni Magnússon, I hope you can all appreciate what big footsteps we're talking about and what an amazing job he did. And also why he's such an inspirational figure for a project like this, because we're not dealing here with the sagas. I don't think we're going to be adding any new manuscripts of Njáls that we didn't know about from our work, but definitely the history of Icelanders in North America and their initial experiences and the literature that came out of that. For a lot of families, for example, they would take family manuscripts, and so certain areas, especially a lot of the manuscripts from those areas, have been taken to North America. So it's incredibly valuable to have access to those in the future, because it's going to tell us so much about this period in our shared history. And I think the more you get to know Árni Magnússon, the more you realize that even though I've emphasized one person, it's not just one guy obsessed with books in the past. He really managed to organize a group effort, and it accomplished much, much more than any of the collectors before him. I don't think when he started university as a 19-year-old, he planned on amassing the world's largest collection of Icelandic and Scandinavian manuscripts. But when you read Árni's letters, you realize it wasn't just Árni who was very enthusiastic about the past. And that's not just what made his collection a success. It was really the collaborative effort of countless men and women who contributed lots of time and resources to this search for manuscripts. And many of those men and women couldn't actually even read the manuscripts in which Árni was so interested, but they shared his belief that those were words worth saving. And Árni Magnússon's story also tells us how much can be accomplished through working together and making copies of shared heritage. Although his original manuscripts get most of the attention, I mean, they're medieval fragments, who doesn't love a medieval book? Árni Magnússon actually did a lot of important copy work as well. He didn't have a digital camera. He would have loved one. So he would employ scribes to make copies of new books. He would actually get a manuscript, he would get a scribe, he would put them together, and then he would make sure that they had done an accurate job of transcription. It was incredibly time-consuming, but he did this for any documents he could borrow, but he couldn't keep. He would make sure that he made a very accurate copy. And a lot of those are the only witnesses we have to those manuscripts. The manuscripts, the originals, have been lost, but his copies have been saved. And finally, I think the more you know about Árni Magnússon, you also realize just how the long-term impact of heritage collection work can last beyond a single person's lifetime and can go in directions that you don't foresee in the present. Árni Magnússon, he built a collection that 300 years on is still producing amazing new research and new knowledge about the past. And I have to say, sometimes he kept things that he actually wrote like kind of like, this is a bit of garbage, and he kept this in his collection, and now people are all over it and, you know, publishing it, and you know, one man's trash is another man's treasure. Thank goodness he didn't throw it away. So I just spent a long time talking about the 17th century, which I have a big love for. I love the 17th century, but I think I'm not just trying to tell you about the 17th century because it's a personal favorite of mine. I think it also has a lot to teach us about ways to save shared heritage in a time of transition between technologies. In our case, it's not manuscripts kind of vellum to paper, but paper to digital. So the paper to digital transition, I think, is something that's you're seeing now very much in how people are sharing heritage and transmitting documents. A lot of times family photographs are being digitized, and nobody's sure where the original is maybe at some point, but it's still in circulation in digital form. So that's a transition that I see happening increasingly today. And I think the main difference between Árni Magnússon's day and ours is that we're not concerned with the shared literary heritage of Iceland and Scandinavia, but really this unique shared heritage that's created through the mass migration of Icelandic families to the US and Canada, and the future study of North American Icelandic language and literature, which I can promise you in 300 years, people will really, really, really be interested in a way that we can't foresee today. it's almost impossible for us to imagine today why anyone in their right mind would want to get rid of a medieval manuscript. It's just, you can't fathom, at least I can't personally. But I'd say it's more easy to understand why people might want to get rid of an old, musty box of books and papers from a damp basement or the loft of a falling down barn. You know, families don't have the space for these paper books, and it can be genuinely hard to tell the difference between something that's unique heritage and absolutely precious and something that's just genuinely a health risk and you need to get rid of because, you know, it's going to damage your health. I had to say, Árni Magnússon, when you look at his stuff, he didn't pass judgment on people who decided that medieval manuscripts weren't worth saving, and they chopped up the leaves and they turned them into flower sieves and they turned them into hat patterns and they turned them into book jackets. I mean, his attitude was just, okay, fine, give me the flower sieve, give me the hat pattern, and please, please, please give me your book jacket. So I think people did think he was quite eccentric at the time, but they went along with it. And for the Fragile Heritage Project, we did really take Árni Magnússon as a role model. So we have photographed even scraps of poetry that people have used as bookmarks. They've torn them up and put them into little to books, and that's just fabulous. We're not just interested in intact and beautiful writing, also these tiny scraps. Another thing I'd say that Árni Magnússon can teach us when we're doing digital collection by taking pictures of books and papers is that it is really important to think about the long-term preservation, even when we're not sure if the future will be interested in our stories. We can rarely go back and check the accuracy of those transcriptions that Árni made of original manuscripts and documents. Usually they've been lost. And the same might be true today. So I think it's important to take really good pictures of every possible feature of these manuscripts that survive now at least 2 times, have copies. Árni Magnússon also made multiple copies of these things. The Fragile Heritage Project is a fairly low-tech initiative. We're not, there do exist in the world amazing scanners that can do fabulous things with manuscripts. But basic digital photography is the main tool that we've been using. It's a great technology for copying books, letters, manuscripts, anything on paper. And of course, you know, a photograph, it can't capture every aspect of a book, you know, how it feels to hold them and turn the pages and what kind of condition they are and how they smell and if they're moldy. You can have an incredibly fragile manuscript. I have a nice facsimile here of an incredibly fragile Árni Magnússon manuscript here. And when you see it, you know, transmitted to a computer screen, it looks pretty much the same as a child's board book. You know, you don't have that dimensionality that you get when you have the originals. But on the other hand, the digital images are really good for protecting the fragile books from too much handling, and they can reveal writing that's too faded to read under normal conditions. So you might think, oh, this book is beyond reading, but thanks to digital technology, it actually, you can do amazing things by just tweaking colors. But as I say, even though it would be possible to do these very expensive multispectral images, what we're concentrating is on the kind of photography you can do with an average ordinary smartphone. And we would love to have it to the point where anybody could contribute pictures of heritage books and letters and documents. So the end goal, I hope, in the end, will look like a virtual version of Árni Magnússon's collection, with the exception that instead of having to go to a physical location, it's as open as possible to anyone who's interested and shares this love of Icelandic language, literature, and history, regardless of whether they're in the US, Canada, Iceland, or somewhere else altogether. The Fragile Heritage Project was fortunate enough to receive a large grant from the Eimskip Foundation that enabled us to involve more students at the University of Iceland from 2015 to 2018. So when I keep saying we, I'd like to acknowledge that it has really been a team effort. First, of course, is Ryan Johnson, who many of you have met, I think, and he's currently completing his PhD at the University of Iceland in medieval Icelandic history. Ólafur Arnar Sveinsson, who's completing a PhD at the University of Iceland in Icelandic history, and he's also working at the National Archives of Iceland. And we've also had Michael McPherson, yet another PhD student like us, who's finishing his PhD in medieval Icelandic linguistics. And in 2019, the project received another Icelandic grant from it's called the Áslaug Hafliðadóttir Memorial Fund, or Styrktarsjóður Áslaugar Hafliðadóttir. It's a memorial fund from Iceland. And we were able to extend the project into the summer of 2019, which was incredibly timely, given that this kind of travel between communities that we were doing at the time has been impossible since the pandemic hit in the spring of 2020. And I think disruptions in the pandemic will continue to impact and affect travel from and to Iceland into the near future, at least. But what those grants enabled was travel between locations so that we could go beyond Manitoba, beyond the radius of our friends and family, as much as we love them, to other communities where Icelandic immigrants had settled. So we could visit university libraries, historical churches, small archives, museums, and families who were all amazing and were so kind with their time. There was definitely a sense of urgency to the Fragile Heritage Project, a sense that this was really important work not to be delayed. And although none of us anticipated the pandemic, I'm very, very thankful we started our work when we did. And I'm excited to continue as soon as it's safe to do so. Even after 6 years, I feel like we barely scratched the surface. There's still a lot of work to be done to ensure the survival of Icelandic immigrants' manuscripts, letters, diaries, and documents in North America for future generations. But we're deeply grateful to have collected thousands of images that we have permission to share in our online database. And in very late 2020, we would have received additional special funding from the government of Iceland to make that database a reality, hopefully this year. So that's, although I can't show you a beautiful finished website, I hope it will be coming as soon as possible. So again, thank you for tuning in and thank you for your time. And I'd say if anyone has any questions, I'd love to answer.
I have lots of questions. Katelin, thank you so much. Now, you just said that you've spent a lot of time going to various communities and churches and universities and things like that. There are probably just as many Icelanders who are not close to an Icelandic community or a university or an Icelandic church that may have documents. Is there anything that we can do to help promote the capture of these rather than flying you to Lakeville, Minnesota to find and preserve some of these documents?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's a community effort. So of course, feel free to send me an email. I'll just put my email in the chat. It says only to the panelists. Can I make it to panelists and area? So I'll put my email. So if anybody would like to contact me,
we'll get it out.
There. So if anybody wanted to contact me now, if they have any ideas, of course, we'd love that. And I do hope that once we get the database online and going ahead, that we'll be able to have some kind of a feature where it's easy for people to donate pictures of their own, because we do want to use this simple technology that most people have. And I think it would make it a lot easier if there was a website that people could just go to and click and, here I've got this and give us some information about that. Might be an easier way for people than to sending us an email. So it depends on what people like.
All right. Well, I also have some props to help kind of clarify what you're looking for, or what would qualify as something you'd want to preserve. This is a book of Cowan Julius poetry that was published in 1946. I think it's probably readily available in Iceland yet. Is this something that you would be interested in knowing about?
So I had a little section and I decided I'm going to stop talking now, but it was about the printed books. Because actually I think a lot of people do own printed books. And compared to like handwritten letters. I think there were just a lot more printed books in circulation. I mean, people had huge libraries. So with the first kind of iteration of the Fragile Heritage Project, we weren't looking at printed books at all, because there's just so many. Not that we didn't think they were interesting, but there are so many, and it is easier to find information about them, I'd say. It was just a question of prioritizing time, because they are if they're handwritten, you just have no idea what they are. Compared to, you might be able to figure out by kind of looking at the type, what edition it is and who it is and Cowan. So our first priority, I think, just in terms of why we were going out and visiting people was people who don't speak Icelandic might not just want to bombard us with pictures and say, I have no idea what this is.
Yeah.
So that's kind of main reason we've been focusing on kind of non-printed books. But as I've been going, I'm really interested in the collections of kind of immigrant libraries. Really interesting. You still find a few of these are still intact within North America, where people would belong to a kind of community organization, and they would buy books as a group, and they would record the information about these books. So there's lots of fascinating, I think printed books are really interesting as well. It's just, as I say, for practical reasons, we've kind of limited our scope.
Yeah, I can understand. So for those of us, like I have this little 200, this is 252 pages. It's about a half inch wide. It was published in 1836. How do we preserve it? I mean, do you have some tips and techniques for how to preserve these until we can talk to you about them and see if they're worthwhile? Like this one has a wooden cover, and indeed, the book cover is in two pieces. One is a printed piece of paper covered by a decorative piece of paper, and they're turning brown and it's very fragile. And so I was just wondering if you have any tips for us.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, actually homemade bindings are something I love and I would love to see, because they're actually quite hard to look at in photography. Like photographs don't quite do them justice, but they're actually pretty sturdy. So books don't like to be wet. Books don't like to have light shining on them directly, but I would say, like, keep them out of your basement if they're that old, and you want to keep them as heritage. Don't feel too badly if a printed book, even if it's 200 years old, is kind of moldy and very damaged, and you feel sick every time you open it up. I think that the printed books are not too much concern if they're very, very, very damaged. We're mostly thinking, if they have, as you say, like the homemade binding or something like that. But I'd say a lot of the books, they are quite sturdy. The newspapers can be challenging because they aren't really designed to last. But I have some older books as well, and they do actually hold up quite well, I'd say.
Okay. Well, I keep mine in a Ziploc bag, so
Yeah.
bumps around and things like that. So really, what you're looking for are more of the handwritten diaries and documents that people have put together. Are you looking in a particular time range? Are you really looking at that 1850 to early 1900 range, or are you looking later than that? Do you have any parameters around that?
So the main parameter we used is whether it's an Icelandic or not, and that's it's not if it was written in 1980 and it's still in Icelandic, we're still interested in that because it's showing the development of the language. Again, it's not because English literature is less interesting, I'd say. It's more because there's more people and more resources to handle stuff in English than there is in Icelandic. It's very hard to catalog something in Icelandic if you're a librarian or an archivist and you're thinking about donating it to somebody in an institution that's not kind of Icelandic speaking, and you're handing them, here, have this piece of paper. We thought, this is really hard. What if we would come in and say, here, this is what it is, this is who wrote it, and all that information, sharing that. This is what it contains as well. So, no, it doesn't have any family secrets in it. So those are kind of our priorities. I have an example of an Icelandic document that is my own diary. I decided to keep a diary last year when we went to Denmark, and it was like 2 minutes before the pandemic hit, and part of it is written in the pandemic. And so it's an example of, imagine it's 100 years earlier and it's a different pandemic. But this is kind of damaged the book that has been quite worn on its journeys, but this is kind of the thing we're interested in. Imagine it's older and it's not my own diary, but but what we've been doing is we've been taking pictures of it kind of page by page, and page by page, and also looking at the front and back again. A lot of the times, as your book is just beautifully bound with a homemade binding and decorative paper, often the binding of these older books can be amazingly beautiful, and they can also have really interesting little bits and pieces bound into them as well. So yeah, I have, that's my example of what a manuscript might look like. It doesn't have to look very impressive. So you have here, like, this is a much older manuscript that you wouldn't expect to see something like that, I think, in North America. But you can find a lot of these ones now on, there's a website called handrit.is, and that's where we're hoping to put some of the Icelandic material from the Fragile Heritage Project as well. But we also want to have a separate database so that people can go in, and we want to catalog it so that it's people's names as well. So it's not just, here's a book, but also the owners, original owners. I'm not talking about the people who own it today. They might want to keep their identity private, but just having people's information, sharing that. Like, oh, this was Guðmundur Katelin who traveled from, this farm, and then you can see, oh, that was my afi, or my langafi, or my langafi, or my amma. These connections I'm hoping we'll be able to make by cataloging in terms of who wrote the material and who owned it, in terms of the immigrants. So I have here, so just to actually, I should do the math better, but so this is the Vesturfariskrá in the paper version. I actually got the last version from the printers. It comes from the university press here, and we went into the basement and we literally found the last copy. So I feel like it's a legacy. But if you look here, each one of those pages, of those thick pages, is just full of people's names, and it's this thick. And it's missing a lot of names too. So I kind of estimated that, imagine that every one of those people had 5 books that were printed. You'd have a huge, huge, huge volume of material. I think the number of manuscripts within that was much less. So it won't be the case that every family has, oh, we have loads of manuscripts hanging out in our basement. But people did write, and I think people shouldn't feel like it has to be a famous ancestor or, something that was very important, like a momentous occasion. We're also really interested in people's everyday lives and how people lived and the stories of everyday people as well. There's a lot written about, famous immigrants, but we're also interested in the experiences of ordinary people. So.
Now we've got, there's likely to have been several families, or maybe even dozens of families, who have donated their documents, the manuscripts, the diaries, to other organizations, whether it's like historical societies or, you know, the museum out in Washington, the state of Washington, Seattle. Are you interested in learning about those, or are you more focused on what's still in the hands of the families that, you know, run a bigger risk of being destroyed and lost?
Well, actually, both, and for different reasons. The reason we're so interested in finding about the institutions who are having them is because a lot of these institutions are so happy to share the material. So they haven't necessarily digitized themselves, but they're really happy to share it. So if anybody does know about an institution that has smaller and has only 1 or 2 items and we might not know about, I would love to know about that, because sometimes it's hard to know where this material has gone. Yeah, it could have been just, you know, one Icelander, and you know, they gave it to their local, you know, heritage museum, and we might not know about that. But if we would go to the heritage museum, I'm sure they would be incredibly happy for us to include all the information on our website, and then the entire family would have easier access to that information. And the eventual plan for on the Icelandic side is to digitize everything here. So although it has gone to Iceland and it's quite distant now, and I think for a lot of people it's hard to access, the idea is to just use these professional digitization facilities and slowly, kind of manuscript by manuscript, piece by piece, make it all online. So in the future, I think there'll be a lot more material available for families to take a look at. But again, we're not asking people to give us their original documents. So if somebody does have something that they want to keep, we completely understand that, and we would love to just have pictures. So as I say, we're interested in both for slightly different reasons.
Okay, all right. Well, I talked with Dr. Árni just before the presentation today, and unfortunately he wasn't able to join. He desperately wanted to participate today, but one of the things he did tell me is a little birdie told me you may be coming to the U.S., particularly Minnesota, later this summer or fall. And are there other opportunities, or how should people just drop you a line, send you a photo of something if they've got questions, to help streamline your process? Because right now you still are physically visiting the sites when the pandemic lifts and you're able to travel again.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like, as much as we know ahead of time, then, you know, the more we can plan, the better it is. And that's, I think, true of any research. If you go out there knowing what you're going to get, then you know, okay, I should spend so much time here, so much time here. So we'd be doing the physical travel has been incredibly challenging, and I think it will continue to be incredibly challenging into the foreseeable future. Even though we're getting vaccines, thankfully, I think we'll have to see. There's been some major delays this week in when the vaccines are being rolled out here. So you know, we definitely have those issues of uncertainty, and the more we can plan ahead of time, the better job I think we'll be able to do.
Okay. All right. Well, we don't have any questions, any additional questions that have come in. So for those of you who are in the audience, if you have any questions, please send them in right now. But I do want to say thank you, Katelin, for giving up your evening to talk with us. I know that you had to get your youngster to bed and things like that before you could join us. And
yeah, and I'm so glad it went so well. I was worried we were cutting it a little bit close, but it's, you know, and as I say, I just at the stroke of 8, I realized in a stroke of genius, I was writing in the wrong passcode, and it was not the long number, it was the word heritage. So
oh, well, thank you so much. And I'd just like to let people know that we do have a couple of other webinars in the works on Thursday, May 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Nancy Marie Brown, who many of you know as an author, is also an avid Icelandic horse enthusiast. And she will be joining us to talk with us about the Icelandic horses and the Icelandic horse industry. A piece of information that went out earlier last week indicated it was going to be Wednesday, May 5th, and that was incorrect. I apologize for that. It is actually Thursday, May 6th, 8 p.m. Central or 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And the information is on the INLUS calendar. So Katelin, again, thank you. We will make sure that we stay in touch and get your contact information out to everybody so that they can start looking through their boxes and then finding all of those handwritten Icelandic pieces of paper that we can't read anymore. So, so thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And I really appreciate the chance to talk. I miss everybody not being able to see you all. So it would be, I hope we can see each other in the near future, but I really enjoyed meeting with you all virtually now.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you all who are attending today. I appreciate you taking the time to join us and helping support this project. So thanks everybody and have a wonderful day.